Welcome to Stats and Scheme. I am Shawn Syed, joined as always by my good friend Seth. Our first live show together on this the day after your birthday. Did you do anything different to prep for this? Or, what do you think our Wi-Fi bandwidth over expected here is going to look like?
Well, happy birthday to you as well. We have back-to-back birthdays, Kansas City Chiefs style. So I think that's pretty cool. But yeah, just hanging out in Detroit over the weekend. Went out for dinner last night. Really just tried to keep up with the free agency news. I feel like it was crazy. So we're going to talk about that on today's show. But how about you? What did you do for your birthday?
Yeah, I mean, as you know, Sunday the Oscars, or my birthday was on Sunday, yours was on Monday. We had the Oscars on Sunday, which is a big deal to me. I know for you, it seemed like it wasn't as entertaining. I will say, between us two, it feels like we have the smallest delta of birthdays between podcast people. So, I think that's a special thing, and I'm glad you mentioned the start of free agency. Obviously, that's what is the biggest thing that's in the news. And I feel like it's a nice thing to mark. Well, next year, maybe the first day of the legal tampering window, which I will say, as a lawyer, that feels like a bit of an oxymoron. But of course, on yesterday's show, Thomas and Eric went through a lot of the bigger news items. I think next week we'll do our little stats and scheme fit between new faces, new places. Today, I did want to take just a step back and look at some of your research on what types of players actually hit free agency up in article form on sumersports.com. Last week, we ended talking just a bit, but in the middle of a season, for me, it's really easy to be excited and think, oh, well, what team is Mike Evans going to end up on, or who is Michael Pittman going to go to, and see what rosters can look like. And then inevitably, those players get tagged. So I did want to talk to you about this. And then really, we think a lot of the free agent signings that happen that I get super excited about, they often don't move the needle maybe as much as I think that we hope. So why don't you cue us up here, Broadly, kind of what were you looking at in your research?
Right, and you brought up Mike Evans and Michael Pittman. That's what caused me to look into this. Is you think about some of these teams during the season, and they're missing a wide receiver, and they're a contending team, and you're thinking oh, all these receivers are going to be free agents next offseason. Like you have Mike Evans, Michael Pittman, T. Higgins, Calvin Ridley. Like all these guys are going to be available for us to sign, and then you have the situation where Evans gets an extension even before the legal tampering period starts, and then both Higgins and Pittman are franchise tagged with one of them reportedly available, but you still don't know the exact details on that. So it's what positions actually do end up hitting free agency was why I wanted to look into this article, where it's when you look at the top X paid players at each position, how many of them are actually available for these teams to sign in free agency? Because free agency is really fun, and it's a good time to follow the news. But what types of players are you getting out of this period when you end up signing them was something I was really curious about.
So you kind of looked at, in terms of top players, it's based on their APY, right? It's not like a measure of their production or something like that. Is that right?
Yeah, so I looked at the average per year that they're making on their contract.
Okay, I think that makes sense. So why don't we'll take us through maybe some positions first. We'll do just player, or yeah, for the top 15, I think you ended up looking at, right? That was your cutoff.
Yeah, so I did top 15 for the positions. It was arbitrary. There wasn't a reason to do it. I just felt like it would capture the top talent at each position pretty well. So when you look at the top 15 at each position in terms of APY, and then how often those players ended up being free agents on their contracts. We didn't look at rookie contracts. We only looked at the second, third, fourth, whatever contracts. And so interior offensive line is lapping the league right now in terms of top paid players that were free agents. 64.4% of the top 15 players were free agents. 31% were drafted, and then only one of them was traded. So, and you even look at this offseason, I think looking at this was kind of a good tell of what was about to happen. Robert Hunt becomes the second highest paid right guard in the NFL. Kevin Dotson, fifth highest right paid guard. John Runyon, sixth highest paid left guard, and then Ezra Cleveland, eighth highest paid left guard. So all these teams are looking into free agency to find interior offensive linemen, which has made it really interesting to follow.
Yeah, that's interesting because, of course, it's a market between all the teams. And then when we look at the cap rises, and we had such a big cap rise in this one, and then the benchmarks for what players have what contracts, that also gets reset just a bit. So that all that combines for an inflation where, of course, more recent contracts are going to litter that top end, and particularly in this look, when you look at who the top 15 APY players are at specific positions. And I guess into your offensive line, like, do you think just if we consider what percentage of the top players are drafted, what percentage are traded, and what percentage are being acquired through free agency, like, is that enough for us to kind of do just the premium, non-premium definition? Of course, I think there's more advanced ways to look at it, but like, do you think that simplified version of if we consider a player to be like, or a position group to be easily acquired in free agency, we can kind of consider that a non-premium position? Do you think that's too reductive?
I don't think so, because when you look at all this holistically, like, it goes back to what we talked about last week, where we're looking at how draft capital has been spent, on different positions, and then when you look at how teams are signing free agents versus keeping things in house, and like you look at the players that, or the position groups that never, like, rarely have free agents: wide receiver, quarterback, defensive tackle, offensive tackle, edge rusher, cornerback. Like, those are positions you would classify as premium in most definitions. And then you look at the other end of that list: interior offensive line, linebacker, safety, running back. So those are positions that you would classify as more of non-premium positions. So like, that's why I think you can look at it that way, where it's like, if a team finds a receiver that is deservingly is deserving of a top 15 APY contract, they will either pay them or trade them to another team so that they can open up cap room to hope to fill that hole. Much like the Chiefs did with Tyreek Hill, Packers did with Devontae Adams, etc. But when teams end up with a top 15 linebacker, top 15 safety, it's more of a coin flip chance that they're going to end up actually paying them to stay on their team. They might let them walk in free agency and end up getting a third or fourth round comp pick out of it.
Yeah, so thinking about receivers, right? We got Tyreek Hill, Devontae Adams, obviously through trade. AJ Brown, Steph Diggs, Amari Cooper, DJ Moore, all through trade, and then other guys up there. Of course, Cooper Kupp drafted DK Metcalf, Debo Samuel, McLaurin, and Keenan Allen. Of course, we'll see what ends up with Keenan Allen, and then how that kind of market gets reset overall. And that's a good way to even go back to Evans and Pittman at the start, where in the middle of the season, I guess if you think that you're a team that needs a receiver, maybe it's just better to look forward to the draft, where we had talked previously that this is a pretty heavy receiver class that I think is a big deal in your team building process. But to be in the middle of the season and think, hey, well, where is this star receiver going to end up next year? It feels like the more often than not, the answer is probably in the same place that they were. Of course, T. Higgins is an example where we'll see, but even then, that is going to be a trade capital allocation in some sort of way, as opposed to just kind of a regular free agent there.
Exactly. Yeah. And if you have a top, 20, 25 receiver, it doesn't do you much good to let them walk in free agency. Like, even if your own team's cap can't support them, you still might as well franchise tag them. Either they play on the tag or they end up getting traded, or you trade a player, like, at some point during their extension. Like, there's a lot of avenues to get value out of a receiver, even if they aren't playing for your team. But like some people in the chat are saying, like, it's the comp picks are usually a pretty big role for a lot of these other positions, but for like these very high end premium positions, it's less of a determining factor in these teams' decisions to let these players walk in free agency.
Going back to the offensive line consideration, Tish, I think you found something that kind of like a relation to college. Do you have anything on that?
Yeah, so it's really interesting about when you look at the difference between how NFL teams build their offensive lines, which is, a lot through free agency, not as much, draft capital invested in it, especially in recent years, versus in college football. It's talked about a lot about how teams can't really build offensive linemen through the transfer portal. There's just not as many offensive linemen available in the transfer portal. You really have to recruit and develop at those positions. And so Anthony Reinhard, who does a lot of good data viz on Twitter, looked into this a little bit, and he found that when you look at a player's position in their final college season, and then you compare it to their first 4 seasons in the NFL, there is, if you're coming from college, you're more likely to switch from interior offensive line to tackle. You're more likely to switch from tackle to interior offensive line going from college to pro. And then interior offensive linemen are not moving to tackle once they reach the NFL that often. So that could be another reason why we have this influx of interior offensive linemen free agents, is because you're drafting a lot of people who played offensive tackle in college and they switch to interior offensive line once they get to the NFL. And then the teams realize that there's a surplus of them and are letting them walk more in free agency.
Yeah, I mean, offensive line development, we could do like a whole podcast series about that. Where obviously in college, there's such a like a heavy premium paid on. They're running so many plays over and over, so sometimes it feels like maybe of course they're teaching the fundamentals and the techniques, but maybe the emphasis isn't as big on that in different ways. And I like that you pointed out, like it's really hard to project a player from guard to tackle. That is something that rarely I think ever happens. And then what usually happens is you have a tackle where the stereotypical example is, oh, this tackle has a little bit shorter arms. Do we need to bump him into guard? Like the conversation does not happen in that other direction. And I'm sure we could talk about it even further, like in terms of what premium positions exist in the NFL and how different that is in college, where in college, it certainly feels like, you're into your offensive line and your running back. I think, I don't know if you agree, like that is such a driving force. Of course, having a top end quarterback would be the best thing to have. But in college, there's, it feels like there are probably a lot better or maybe a lot more top end running backs than quarterbacks on kind of a usual basis. Do you see that at all, Tage, when you think about it?
I totally agree with you. I think that when it comes to college and just like kind of the distribution curves of a lot of these positions, interior offensive line and running back can mean a lot. Like we've seen some college offenses built off of the running back position. Like you think about, what Ohio State did in the transfer portal this year, like where they already have Travion Henderson, who's probably going to be a pretty high day 2 pick in next year's draft. They go out and get Keyshawn Judkins from Ole Miss, pay him top dollar to come to Ohio State just to have those two running backs. Like, paying two running backs in the NFL, would have a lot of discourse about it, but in college you can get away with it because of the NIL budgets and then also the positional value.
Yeah, I mean, I got excited thinking about Aaron Jones and Josh Jacobs together. Sent you a few texts, and then within a few minutes had that shutdown. And it's interesting, like how if you consider the NL budgets, like as a free agency, like in different ways. Obviously, that's different than what our NCAA 14 days will be. Maybe that EA Sports College Football 25. How we're going to deal with that on our dynasty is going to be different. I wanted to ask a question from the chat. Does hitting free agency at a premium position have inherent signal that the incumbent team does not want to pay market value? I like that question. I want to run it by you. And then also just thinking that there is an information gap for players on a team versus a player on a new team. I think that in the middle of a season when there's player acquisitions, it's really excited to get it's easy to be excited about those player acquisitions. But like the team that's trading away a player or releasing a player in some way usually does have more knowledge at least. And of course, now there are things like, well, maybe the coaching staff's a little different. Maybe that gels with the player a little bit different. But there is like that information gap is always important to me, where that team has a lot of detail on that player where a new team may not. Do you have any kind of thought on that question, Tage?
Yeah, I mean that is a great question, and like it really does go back to when you believe that you're getting a steal. When relative to the market, like there always should be some questions about it. Like they do turn out to be steals sometimes in free agency and the draft, but there's always like the crowd's opinion on someone or the team's opinion when they have the information advantage does mean a lot. So, we rarely see quarterbacks, defensive tackles, offensive tackles that are at the top of their position actually do get signed as free agents. So, the ones that do in this free agency, or, we can go back and look at the last couple of years, like it'll be interesting to look at like kind of how they fared once they went through that process first, staying on their team with an extension or actually being traded.
All right, getting back on track with kind of how often top players make it to free agency. So we talked about interior offensive line. Kind of the next one is linebacker, right? That the highest percentage of players are kind of making it to free agency at the top 15 in average per year.
Exactly. Yeah. Linebacker is the other position that teams will spend on in free agency. And, you saw Ryan Poles and the Bears do this last year where they go out and they pay high end money for Tremaine Edmonds. They also pay TJ Edwards. So they're paying two very high linebackers through free agency that they acquired through free agency. Like, but I think that their strategy is pretty clear about focusing on premium positions in the draft and trying to get some of these non-premium positions in free agency because they know that one, they'll be available, and two, that's kind of that's their way of thinking that they can generate the most surplus value.
I do wonder, linebackers kind of across the board, maybe more in this specific draft class, but like how much do you tie those things together? Where I think that, you look at the linebacker draft class here, and I think it'd be fair to say people maybe a little bit lower on it than usual. And so, all right, well, if you're thinking ahead and saying, well, boy, we're either going to get this type of player in the draft or through free agency, if we feel, we're like we'd rather spend our draft capital elsewhere, or just our evaluations kind of feel lesser about that, maybe that's also a different route to go. And then there's, of course, the difference between can we acquire this position in free agency and then what we should pay that position. Because I think when the Bears got Edmonds, I think a lot of people looked at it and said, oh, like that's pretty high. But I guess, Tajan, like, should we consider like, well, what phase of your team building process are you in? Because if you're maybe like 2 years away from like really feeling like you're going to compete for a division, maybe you get that contract on the books a little bit easier. And I don't know, maybe you can structure it in a way where it feels like a little bit kind of easier to swallow later on.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean that's a really good point to bring up. Where it's like if you are spending on these positions in free agency, what does it kind of mean for your stage of the team building process? And our friend Eric Eager like wrote an article on Sumersports.com about like some free agency proverbs to follow. When you look at it, it's like one of the points that like was really significant to my thinking about this stuff is like trades for veteran players are underutilized and undervalued by teams. So it's like if you make these free agent signings, and like the NFL is a league where you want to generate as much surplus value as possible with like a war to dollar type calculation, it's very hard to get positive surplus value on a lot of these free agent signings. You're paying top of the market, and then you really have to wait until like year three of the contract, if it's like a 4-year deal, where they're gonna be like not top of the market. When it comes to APY, like you brought up. So it's like maybe you do make a trade for these players that are already in the middle of their contract, and that way they're already like the 10th highest paid linebacker instead of the second highest paid linebacker in the league. And you feel like you can get similar play out of them. So it's like those types of trade-offs that these teams have to make when looking at these types of decisions are always really like intriguing to see how they handle them.
Yeah, I did like Eric. I think he did a really good job in that article and thinking about like players that you trade for, and even in his like trade deadline column, talking about trade people you would target when they're on the kind of middle of their contracts. I do want to ask you a little bit there, Tage. So like signing premium players, for example, is like obviously that is going to be a very, very hard thing to do. And thinking non-premium players, like safety, that's going to be another position, of course, in a this actually, I mean, even aside from that, like this safety class feels like almost special when I'm looking at it in free agency. You got guys in so many ways that are kind of coming on. Even aside from that question, you got any thoughts kind of on like safety as a position in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think like you brought up the specific safety class this year, where it's like you might not have to go out and sign the best safety on the market, just because the safety market has been so saturated this year with like all these playable safeties available. So it's like, how do you kind of want to treat how you're building your safety room in free agency this year, where the Packers had one method where they want to go and they want to pay Xavier McKinney, who's young and a good safety and someone who can help their new defensive coordinator, Jeff Hafley, and spend top of the market, give him a top of the market contract. Or you're going to see some other teams, I think, pay two safeties who are not as good as McKinney, but maybe their two contracts will add up to his cap hit, and they hope to make back that impact in the aggregate. So like I think when you look at that in particular this year, like that's something that will follow closely as some of these more safeties sign, because they've been a little bit slower to sign than other positions so far. But when it comes to the contracts in particular at some of these positions, like I think another thing that's underutilized is including void years in the contract if you have an owner that is willing to set the cash aside to do that, where you can take a player's signing bonus that is going to be guaranteed, and instead of prorating it out over the 3 years of the contract, taking 18 million and giving 6 million a year, you can tack like 3 or 4 void years onto that contract. And now all of a sudden you have to give out a $3 million signing bonus every year for the next 6 years. So the player's still getting their money, but it's going to count. It's going to, count against your own cap $3 million less each year. And with the cap increasing, you're making a bet that that percentage of the cap that you're actually going to be paying out is just going to get smaller and smaller every year.
When thinking about guys that maybe have had either less production or just less snaps, I think the first example I think of is Bryce Huff going to the Eagles, where that he plays a premium position and he's, I think, an incredible pass rusher and is able to produce on third downs. Does it make sense if you are a team that is kind of like making a further projection out, even like a Grenard as an example, where he is at an earlier part in his career? Like, is that the gamble that you want to make? You want to gamble on a guy who maybe has just been around less, where it's Grenard versus, for example, Daniel Hunter, in that specific example, as opposed to at a non-premium position, like making that gamble where you're going off a player that maybe had 1 or 2 year production? Or do you think it's just going to be kind of 2 player specific to really break down?
No, that's a really good point to bring up. I think, when you make that bet with Bryce Huff, and then let's say like the Steelers, for example, signing Patrick Queen, we're like, we don't know what he'll look like without Roquan Smith next to him. So you're kind of making a similar gamble in those situations. I think it's easier to digest, if you're a fan of the team, for the Bryce Huff side, because just of where they stack up on the list of contracts, right? So like if they're getting paid the exact same APY, an edge and an off-ball linebacker, just like that off-ball linebacker is a little bit harder to kind of move on from if it doesn't work out, because like you said, like there's just less of them in the draft. And then they're also just going to be higher paid relative to the other people at their position. Whereas the edge, there's a lot of them in the draft, and so you can kind of hedge your bets a little bit by taking one of those guys, or you can even make it where you have like a contract that's pretty low down on the list of average per year, and that way it's a little bit easier to stomach if it actually doesn't end up working out for them. But what I'm curious to hear from you is when you do actually look at these players from a schematic standpoint, when they switch teams and they're asked to do more at their new roles, how do you like kind of project that internally when thinking about like the impact that they can have this upcoming year?
I think I overrate roles a little bit sometimes. Like it's easy for me to think of like like Van Ginkel is an example I really like, going from Dolphins under Fangio, where he was, dropping out as an edge sometimes, now going to Flores in Minnesota, where like they will run that kind of like 3-3 look where he essentially is playing a similar position. So of course there's like that kind of direct translation. With Huff, where Fangio will, in their base, they're going to have that real outside linebacker position who, like, they are an edge setter in the run in so many ways. So I don't know. I guess I just try not to overthink it too much, because I think trust the coaches in in a lot of ways. I think like if we think of Kirk Cousins, for an example, that's like an easy kind of translation a little bit, because it's like, okay, well, he just went from Kevin O'Connell, who we can think about him most recently under the McVay tree. He's going to Zach Robinson, who, I mean, I imagine that a lot of the words that they use are going to be the same. So I imagine that there's a level of comfort for Cousins there. So for me, it feels like, okay, when you can see the direct line, like, yes, that is a plus, but at the same time, it's the players that you're playing around that makes a lot of a difference. So I guess I have, again, I have a hard time with the Huff to Fangio one, just because maybe the way that they'll use him, like, is he going to play an outside linebacker on those rundowns? I don't know. I mean, we that's another one where it feels like a projection in a few ways, because he's just had less, like his season with the Jets. I think that his snaps were like, I don't know, it was like half of the amount of snaps that Christian Wilkins had, who of course had an incredible amount of snaps. And Wilkins is a good example where, I don't care what the scheme is, like that guy is gonna play with his hair on fire, and playing next to Max Crosby, he's gonna be really, really good. So I think that there is, of course, like a kind of like a graph where it's gonna be a moving point in a lot of different ways, but it's gonna come down to coaching. I think that it's another reason why I get super excited about the free agency moves, but sometimes things aren't going to work out based on a lot of things. And projecting, like, Patrick Queen's an interesting example where you know his role. I think when we broke down so much of that Baltimore stuff last year with Mike McDonald, he was able to do a specific role partially because Roquan Smith was able to do so much in his specific role. So
Mhm.
like, what does that look like for Queen? I think Queen is good. And I think he's going to be able to produce in Pittsburgh in different ways. But it's still you're making some sort of translation, and that almost goes back to the information gap where like all these things are projections, and maybe because like when we make football projections in the drafts, for example, it has such a low hit rate that a lot of time I think in free agency there's low hit rate.
Well, I think you touched on like so many interesting, important things there. Where it's like when you take players out of the current situation that they're in, and like that's the draft and that's free agency when they switch teams. It's like the uncertainty just like widens like crazy. Like you really know like kind of how a player is going to perform that's been in the league for 3 or 4 years in the next upcoming season. As long as they're staying with their own team. Like I think we know who some of those players are at that point. Obviously, there's breakouts and players who fall off, but like I would say like 80% of them kind of stay in a similar range for what they were doing the day before or the year before. But then you have these free agents where it could go really well, it could go really poorly. The median outcome is obviously in between that, and it's like you're just like widening the range of outcomes on these players when you have them change situations. And so like when you talk about it from a schematic standpoint, that like Kirk Cousins point was really interesting to me, where it's like maybe it'll go better than some of the other veteran quarterback switches did in their first year, just because the language might be more similar, or the offense might be schemed up more similar to what he's used to. And then like the Van Ginkel point too as well, where it's like, yeah, he's been someone who Van Ginkel and Wilkins, I guess, playing in those Miami defenses, like they've seen some very unique styles of defense between Flores and Fangio, where it's like now you're moving with Wilkins to like a entirely new defensive scheme. Like that could be really great for him. He could really improve his pass rushing ability and keep his run stuffing ability at a high level. Or he takes a little bit of a decrease for his run ability, and then also increases his pass ability. Like there's just so many moving parts that can happen when these players switch teams.
Yeah, I now I'm glad I feel like we talked about this because it almost maybe it is just more of like, well, who are the players playing next to you as opposed to just like the direct scheme fit and well, what kind of scheme does this coach run kind of in different ways? Like Saquon Barkley is an example where whatever you think of the contract, whatever you think of the Eagles signing a running back, I have to think that this is going to be the best offensive line that he is able to run behind in his entire career. So now what you think of Saquon, what you think of well, the price tag that they paid for him, maybe they're trying to signal, hey, we need this player to be involved in the passing game. Like remove that totally to the side for a second. A player that is in a better surrounding situation, I think that's going to be a positive. Now, are we going to capture like the top end of Saquon Barkley's play? I'm not sure. But then we're talking about Derrick Henry, for example, like that's one where it's so easy to get excited about that one, right? Tage, like Derrick Henry running downhill with Lamar Jackson being like a horizontal stretcher, and then obviously they can kind of bring in like Keaton Mitchell in different ways. Hopefully he comes back healthy and is running fast. Like, come on, you're excited about the running backs too, right? Regardless of what we consider their premiumness of their position.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, like I think it goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, where it's like this is a function of premium, non-premium to an extent when looking at how often these top players are actually making free agency for their positions. But I think it's also a function of translatability. And so like I think about interior offensive line as like a position that translates a lot easier from team to team than something like edge rusher, defensive tackle, where you're more working together as a group, and like there's a lot of interaction effects happening between different defensive linemen that I don't think you see as much with offensive linemen, just because you're more focused on kind of your role for that play. And I think running back is similar to interior offensive lineman, where it's like it's not like you're going to have to fit into another team's like route tree and like kind of learn a whole new style of offense if they run a totally different passing game than the passing game that you were a part of during your rookie contract. But like for running back, it's like it's easier to see how the skills and the traits will translate, because like it's more of like a downhill type position where you're kind of moving in a direction anyways. And it's just like what you do to take advantage of that. So I like that point that you brought up there with just like seeing how well it's going to translate from position to position.
Yeah, I feel like this episode's making me just scared about like all translatability, because even thinking about it, like the interior offensive line, those are the contracts that we're seeing get passed and forth. Like, I do think the interior offensive line, whether you're passing stunts off, like there is going to be communication. Of course, there is a part of like when when Myles Garrett is lined over you, you're gonna have to block him. And if you can block him in one scheme, sometimes you can block him in another. But I like that you mentioned those kind of interaction effects. And then I think things we don't always see, whether like we mentioned the verbiage with Kirk and things like that, where offenses are really, really complex, defenses are really, really complex, and then the ability of a coach to get their players to play fast, that's different from coach to coach. But Tej, why don't we think about it in the kind of like 16 to 30 range for APY and going through free agency? So instead of just the like, okay, well, we consider these positions at the top end to be available in free agency, and that kind of more middle tier, what are we thinking about some of the positions that end up being moved around in free agency?
Yeah, so when it comes to the middle tier of APY contracts, that's really where we see quarterbacks start to shift teams. And you can think of so many examples of this. Kirk Cousins, being a very recent example. I know he's going to end up being in the top 15 of APY at the beginning of his stint at the Falcons, but I think he might drop down below. But like a Derek Carr, type of quarterback move last year, where it's like he's moving teams and he is moving as a free agent and like getting a contract that's somewhere in that range. Jimmy Garoppolo, I think, is another example of that. It's like those types of quarterbacks where teams aren't necessarily committed towards keeping them, unless there's some type of circumstances where it's like you can kind of move on from this player, hope you get a rookie quarterback, or maybe you trade for a quarterback. Like there's a lot of other avenues to go to find a new quarterback when you have someone in that 16 to 30 range.
Yeah, I really want to see who is gonna. I imagine someone's gonna trade up for a quarterback certainly at some point in the draft. If we see in the first round, I wonder if it is going to be someone, or if we just go Bears, Commanders, Patriots, quarterback, and then I don't know, maybe someone going to trade Arizona at 4. If Arizona goes Marvin Harrison, then is someone going to trade down to 5? Because I know, mentioning Eric again, who wrote a good article about just like the transient nature of like what kind of like quality of team you are. So if you're a really, really bad team, going from really bad to like one of the higher tiers, it actually happens a little bit quicker than I think we think. So like if you just optimize your team for being an average team, which I don't think anyone's intentionally doing that. I think these situations, unfortunately, like they happen to teams, but like just going after that kind of like mid-level isn't always as effective, because if your goal is to just kind of capture that fancy trophy at the end is going to be good. But Kirk Cousins, we obviously, everyone I know gives him his flowers in terms of just being like a first team business school Hall of Famer. Like if you're like a kind of in that tier of quarterbacks to be able to continue to bet on yourself. I mean, he just had an Achilles injury, right? And he's him able to get more money going forward is going to be interesting for sure. What other position do you think in that kind of middle tier is able to be accessed in free agency?
Yeah, so running back's another one. And I think we've seen that these past couple of days where like basically half the teams in the league are swapping out their starting running back for another starting running back that was like playing elsewhere last year, where it's like you have the Packers swapping out Aaron Jones for Josh Jacobs. You have the Bengals, which is a move I really like, swapping out Joe Mixon for Zach Moss, and I assume that they'll draft someone to supplement him there. And like the Ravens kind of let Gus Edwards walk, went towards Derrick Henry. Like just so many of these teams want a fresh look at running back, and like we'll usually see that with this mid-tier. I was obviously very happy with how David Montgomery worked out as a free agent signing for the Lions last year. The whole NFC North is kind of changing their, the running backs that they've had for a while are kind of moving on now. So that's been another one. And then, some of the other positions where teams will try to keep on to them, but it's less of a probability of it happening compared to the top 15 in APY. Edge rusher, cornerback, wide receiver, offensive tackle. Those are still positions where we'll see a decent amount of free agency happen, but there's still positions where teams will try to extend those players if they are drafted by them, or they'll end up resorting to trading them, if they need to. So I thought it was interesting that those were the positions that popped up at the bottom of this list as well.
Did you have anything else more to say on the Zach Moss move? I wonder, even if aside from just Zach Moss, like if teams that we've heard a few things about teams asking a player to take a pay cut, and I don't know if I'm a player, like you're going to be hard pressed for me to take a pay cut. I think it makes sense for a lot of decisions based on to be, well, what team is offering this player actually the most money. Of course, there's going to be on the edges certain like circumstantial situations where like this team is just like a better overall fit in a few ways. But I guess, there is a little bit of value in like you're just bringing a new player. Like you haven't had to have that kind of hard conversation. Like you're able to kind of have whatever. Hopefully you can replicate that kind of production with, a similar cap. But I don't know if on Moss specifically, if you had any more thoughts on that, because I saw a few people really praising that move for the Bengals.
Yeah, I mean, it makes a lot of sense from the Bengals' perspective. Like, I think that there are so many ways to obviously build out any position group, but like I think the way that I really like is to sign a free agent running back for 4 to 5 million a year, like the Bengals did with Zach Moss. You can kind of have like a third running back on the roster already, like they have with Chase Brown, and then you can take a running back that has like a different style than that free agent running back that you signed on day 2 or early day 3 of the draft. And like not to bring everything back to my Lions, like obviously I was critical at the time of the Jahmyr Gibbs pick just because of like opportunity cost. But like I do kind of see their vision when they were building out the running back room. Now that I'm seeing some of these free agent running back deals that have been given out, where it's like, yeah, they wanted to sign someone like David Montgomery and they wanted to draft someone like Jahmyr Gibbs, where you have these complementary styles that are different stylistically, and then they can kind of work off of each other, and you're not spending a lot of money on your running back room in particular, because the Jahmyr Gibbs contract is cost controlled, being a rookie deal for 5 years. He's on a cost control, right? So it's like you're just making sure that you have good value at the running back position. But I still I think that the Bengals are going to execute this really well, when it's all said and done after the draft.
With the running back, like the market in general, it feels like, like Saquon, I think got a pretty healthy amount of money. I think that's something that he can feel good about. So I've seen and thought about it a little bit. Well, like, do these running backs getting these contracts, is that the indication of, this running back class is lesser? I do, again, I think that we're not going to see like a Bijan Robinson or Gibbs drafted in the same way that they were last year. I have a hard time thinking about it because like you should be able to find a running back in the third round in like in a rosterable way. Like it's not like you're drafting like 100% special teams player. So I don't know. And then if you have any thoughts on the like, we'll do these contracts like fully signal directly, hey, like these teams are really uncomfortable with this running back class, or do you think it's a little bit more kind of player specific, or like a function of the cap rising and how these
Mhm.
contracts are going, or is it just a function of like all of the 7 things that I just threw at you there, Tage?
Well, I do think it's actually a combination of a couple of those things, right? So it's like the cap rising is the big one. So, when teams plan for X amount of cap space to spend, you have your projections, and you're kind of ready to go a little bit over your projections if you have to, but you want to stay to them in free agency. And then the cap rises like crazy. And it's much more than most people expected. And so now you're adjusting all your projections a little bit. You have this 10-15 million that you didn't plan on having before ready to spend in free agency. And like we said, like the premium positions aren't available that often in free agency. So you might as well go for the non-premium positions and spend the extra money there to really make sure that you have those positions locked down. And you just kind of hope that the cap keeps rising at a similar rate where your contract that you paid by year 3 will look a lot better, than it looks right now. And I think that's like a bet that these teams are more than happy making. And then you look at some of the guaranteed money that's been given to running backs this week, where Saquon Barkley, according to Over the Cap, got 26 million guaranteed by the Eagles, which is the 4th most in the NFL. DeAndre Swift got 15.3 million guaranteed by the Bears, which is the 8th most in the NFL. So it's like these teams are looking at probably this running back draft class, like you mentioned, and seeing that there's no first round running back. Maybe there's a running back or two that'll be taken in the 2nd round, but even, that could be something that is up in the air right now. So it's like, you might as well kind of get the sure thing at running back in their eyes. They're kind of seeing it as like the consistent option that they can bring in. And then maybe they'll supplement it with a 3rd, 4th, 5th round pick to kind of balance out that style and to have, be on the right side of the age curves.
And then going back to thinking about receivers, the other real big skill position there, of course, we got the Gabe Davis deal. I think a lot of people are waiting to see is Calvin Ridley. I think what was last reported was the Patriots had an offer to him, and it seems like he's weighing that with the Jaguars. I think something about the Jaguars. There's like something with if they sign him on Wednesday, it's better for I think whatever formula that goes into. But that I think goes back to the start of our conversation where we look at Pittman and Evans; those guys get tagged. Higgins, of course, gets tagged as well, and so we're not going to get a lot of big contracts because not a lot of those players get there. And I think teams, hopefully, they're able to luck out with a lot of the players that people are excited about in the draft. Another thing, Tay, is just like living the fun of free agency through Twitter. Like something that's hard for me is, well, like what is the real money for these players? Like what we see that's initially reported, often it is a lot different or than what it actually is. Specifically in terms of, well, how many of these like are really just dummy years in a lot of ways, where what looks like on paper a 4-year contract is really just a 2-year contract, where we feel pretty comfortable that a player is likely not going to be on the roster after that third or that second year, for example. Like, I don't know, what's your kind of thought process for like when do we give a thumbs up or a thumbs down on a like a who won free agency or what a team did kind of as their approach?
Yeah, I mean, I think like, when you look at, there's so many good people out there that do projections for free agency. Whether it's Brad Spielberger or Daniel Salib or some other people on Twitter, where it's like when you look at what they projected for their contracts, because they are so good at projecting some of these contracts, like down to the years, the APY and the guaranteed. Sometimes they'll nail all three of those on some of these. So it's like if you see a player end up getting signed for a lot less than what these guys projected them to be, like I think those are good value signings. And like, it goes back to the information advantage we talked about at the beginning. Like we don't have all the information that these teams have, but there's still the signal in the wisdom of the crowd and the predictiveness of the wisdom of the crowd approach happening here. So like the Josh Uche one, where right before we went live here, it's like they had him projected, I think, around 6-7 million. He ended up signing for 3 million. It's like I kind of know, from the bat or like off the bat, they're like, that's a pretty good signing by the Patriots. We'll end up seeing what happens and to that specific deal. But like I think it's going to be good value for the Patriots. It seems like it's something that's a lower risk, higher reward option. So like those are things that you can use to evaluate. But yeah, the contract details thing in particular is a little bit of pet peeve of mine, because obviously it's the agents giving the information to the insiders. So it's like you want to have that relationship. Like it makes total sense from both sides. But when they give an initial report and they say it's a 3-year deal worth up to 50 million, and I see everyone quote tweet it, they're like, how could they give this guy $50 million? It's crazy. And then the actual details come out, and like the entire third year of the deal, the last year of the deal is like a dummy year where it's like $18 million and only like a $2 million dead cap if they were to be released before that year. And you're like, oh, that makes sense. Like now you actually see the details of the contract.
Tage, the words, they matter. The words really do matter. I'm glad you mentioned Brad. I think Brad Spielberg does such a good job. And I love tracking his stuff just really even just yesterday, because even he, I think, said like, wow, these numbers for the guards are really even higher than some of them that they projected. And that I think also captures a lot of stuff we talked about today. I think also when we went on Devontae Parker, I think it was like a 1-year pretty like low contract for the Eagles. And those are the free agent moves that I think like I really like seeing. Because the Eagles, like they are a lot of times like they have that third receiver role. They'll roll out a lot of 11 personnel. We'll see how much that kind of stays with Kellen Moore, but like that's like an ultra specific role that it's like not like, yes, receivers are premium position. Is your wide receiver 3 like the most premium position? Probably not, but like it absolutely has to be a role that is filled. Obviously, like Parker, I think has like some name recognition in terms of all of the wide receiver 3s that are out there. So those are the ones that I feel like they're hard for us to be like, this is a great move, but it's more of like, okay, well, like you need a person to fill that role. And I think that sometimes we don't always look directly at, well, free agency is also like, if you are a team that has to fill these huge holes in free agency, that's usually a commentary that like your team has a really long way to go. Of course, I mean, the Eagles certainly hope to be a team that doesn't have a long way to go. So, you have to make those moves that are kind of on the margins in a lot of different ways. Like, I'm sure you feel good about your Lions making some moves at cornerback this week, right?
Yeah, I mean, these are the moves I like in free agency, right? Where like you don't have to go out and pay like a top 5 at position money to a player and like hope that you can get value out of that. Like I like these types of moves, like the Devontae Parker one, the Josh Uche one, where it's like these players are coming in to fill a specific role for your team. Like you don't think that they're going to be superstars and like you're not paying them to do that, but you just give yourself more breathing room when you give out these types of deals. Like the Lions are doing, taking multiple shots at cornerback. Like, it's a little bit rich to trade that much for Carlton Davis, but their overall philosophy, I think, is just to throw multiple darts at the dartboard for corner. Sign Robertson today. I'm sure they have another move or two in them at defensive back. So it's like you just want to keep taking chances that are lower risk and then like a potential for decent sized reward if they end up working out.
Yeah, I mean, I really like Josh Uche. So I don't know. After we finish up here, I'm gonna look back on that because that number did look like a little low. So I wonder what that kind of will end up as. So I feel like the overall takeaway here is like we should stop looking at our Dak Prescott jersey swaps for next year when he's like quote a free agent. I think that regardless of what your feeling is in the middle of the season, the most likely outcome, certainly based on the research, and I think based on what is realistic, is he's most likely going to be a Cowboy again.
I think so too. Yeah. I mean, I think like the Cowboys being so quiet in this free agency, I have a couple of friends that are Cowboys fans. I know that some of your family members are as well, where it's like, yeah, you're going to have to give 3 possibly market setting extensions to Dak Prescott, CeeDee Lamb, and Micah Parsons, either, this offseason or next offseason. Like, if I'm Jerry Jones, I'd be wanting me to save the money too.
But those are the 3 positions. Like that is, I think that's the situation you want to be in, right? Like,
right. Exactly. Yeah.
Winning in free agency isn't winning in games. Like those, if you tell me that, hey, we need to like set the market at quarterback, receiver, and our star 1-of-1 edge rusher, that's exactly kind of what you want, right? Like that shows that you drafted well, you developed and ended up finding yourself in a good situation, right? Like that's not a bad thing.
No, I'm totally with you. Yeah, no, it's I mean, it's a great like problem. It's not even a problem to have, where it's like you want to nail those positions in the draft. Like that's why you draft those types of positions. That's why you work hard on developing those positions where you do hope that you can end up giving them a market setting extension one day, because like that means that they did well when they were playing for you.
Yeah, and the hope is that you're able to capitalize when, like, before you hit those huge, where you're getting like a lot of surplus value out of those players. And it's unfortunate, obviously, the windows in the league are so small. I don't know if you've seen, like, it's been fun to see how many of like now former Cowboys are becoming Commanders, where Dan Quinn is signing a lot or getting a lot of those players. I do like that, where it's there can be certainly like a remorse in the sense of like you think or like this is a player that therefore you take them. But then also, as we said, like the information gap, like you do have a lot of extra information. I don't know if you're like if you switch places, would you be someone that's just kind of cherry picking those players back again?
Well, I think it makes a lot of sense in your first off season, right? Because you get to a situation, especially with the Commanders, where it's basically new ownership, new GM, and new head coach, like all the way across the board. Where it's like you might have just not had the time to fully prepare, entire free agency reports that your team can use when it comes to going out and signing players. So it's like you kind of want to go with know, or like what and go out and sign some of these players from your former team, like whether it's Adam Peters signing players from the 49ers, Dan Quinn signing players from the Cowboys, or some of your position coaches that you brought in elsewhere, like being able to know what you want to sign from your class. And like they're not like doing anything crazy with these contracts. Like I think they all make sense. And then like when it comes to the draft too, like you could see teams that have a new kind of front office coach situation. Like maybe they have a tendency to trade for future picks more, like the Cardinals did last year, just because like you didn't have the time and the infrastructure set up to really prepare for the off season. And like you're going to be ready next year once everything is in place.
Yeah, that I like that point. The new head coach kind of team building exercises is really interesting. Like certainly I think in Seattle and how McDonald is going to do over there. And like you said, yeah, like there's a lot of stuff that they've been doing. Also, of course, they're going to try or certainly do their best to be able to get as much on as many players as possible. But I think that's a good place to wrap it up. Thank you everyone for listening to another episode of Stats and Scheme. Tell us what you like, what you didn't like, and if you think Taja's going to get hit with some recruiting violations when we start our NCAA 2025 Dynasty. Visit sumersports.com/subscribe. Follow us on Twitter and YouTube at Sumer Sports. Leave a nice rating wherever you choose to be. I think next week we'll talk about some of the players we're excited to see on their new teams. But most importantly, enjoy the rest of your week, and we'll see you next time.